This is our inaugural presser via video conference. We've not tried this before, so it's a bit of an experiment for us. The way it'll work is much like a regular presser. Robert Mansell will go through a brief PowerPoint and frame the issue based on the research that is in the paper that we're releasing today. And then we will open it up to Q&A via the typing box that you've got there. But your Q&A won't be limited to that. If afterwards you want to either send a camera, do Skype, or get on the telephone, just give me a call. My number is on the advisory and will also be on the screen at the end of the slide presentation. Robert Mansell is an emeritus professor of economics at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, and he's released a paper today with a couple of co-authors who Robert can introduce on the regional distribution of federal fiscal transfers. This matters in the wake of the Fair Deal report that was issued last week. And with that, Robert, I will turn it over to you to start briefly going through your PowerPoint.
Okay, thank you, Morten. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to provide a summary of the paper today on behalf of my co-authors, a well-functioning federation is bound by shared values, history, and economic arrangements that attempt to ensure that all regions are better off within the federation than outside of it. But a common tension within the Canadian Federation is that regions often feel they're not getting a fair deal, a fair share, and most often this has to do with their view on federal fiscal policy, particularly the amount of revenue that they generate or provide to Ottawa versus what comes back. We know, for example, based on recent surveys, that having this in certain regions. In the case of Alberta and Saskatchewan, over 60% of the residents. That compares to only 20% in Ottawa, 34% in Quebec. Now, these numbers have changed from time to time. Going back to earlier history, obviously, there was a lot of Maritimes about the time of Confederation. And in the 80s, again, said about energy policy and so on. But really what I want to focus on is really just the federal fiscal policy issues around these tensions. I should point out that there's really two types of tensions. One we call conflict of tastes, and it arises from differences in language and culture. Example in Canada, I guess, is Quebec. And then there's conflicts of claim, which is what we're dealing with today. Claim on resources, claim on potential, and so on. So I'd like to go to the next slide, please. This study focuses on the regional distribution of federal fiscal balances over almost 6 decades, from 1961 to 2018. Most of the regional redistribution in Canada has occurred over this period. For example, the Equalization Program was introduced in 1957, CPP, and so on in the early 60s. So it really captures the major part of regional redistribution of income, employment, and population associated with federal fiscal balances. Now, the federal fiscal balance is a simple concept. It is the total of all revenues collected by the federal government in a region minus all the federal money that comes back to the region in the form of expenditures of one sort or another, or transfers to individuals, provincial governments. So if there's a positive balance, it means that there's money flowing out of the region. In other words, there's a surplus. If it's a negative balance, it means that it's an inflow. Two things to know. First of all, by taking a long-run view, we get away from the problem. You often hear that, a province says, well, we're contributing too little, and they're looking at just a couple of years of data. To do a fair analysis of the regional distribution, you need to take a long-run look, because there is an ebb and flow. Secondly, I want to point out that the balance does include the transfers associated with all programs. And I'll later come back to the 10 main policies that we examine. People often just assume it's equalization. Well, as it turns out, equalization only accounts for about a quarter of all federal income. Next slide, please. This analysis is within kind of a standard framework. We typically think of 5 economic goals of a federation. The first being the development of national infrastructure and sharing of those costs, including those of maximizing power or leverage in an international setting. For example, when we're negotiating international trade agreements, it's better to act as a federation as opposed to individual regions. Third one is really reducing barriers or eliminating barriers to interregional adjustment mechanisms involving the transfer or interregional movements of goods, services, capital, labor, and technology. The fourth one is providing stabilization and insurance to offset instability associated with regional specialization. And the final is promoting horizontal equity, equal treatment of equals, and vertical equity. So the focus here is really just on the last 2 elements, but I want to emphasize that when it comes to regional conflict, it also involves the first 3 items, and there's a lot of history and other politics associated with that. For example, in the case of interregional trade flows, there's big problems in terms of barriers to trade, and it costs Canada dearly. Estimates range from 50 billion to 130 billion a year, or it's an equivalent to a tariff between 7 and 14%. So that's a big issue. And case of transportation infrastructure, I don't have to remind you of all the issues around pipelines. That costs the country 10 to 15 billion dollars a year. So there's a lot of problems, and as I mentioned, a lot of history going back to that control over natural resources and so on. Next slide, please. So to start with, here's a picture of the federal fiscal balances on a per capita basis. So we take account of the huge differences in population across the regions by casting everything in per capita terms. And this graph just shows it for 2 periods, the full period, 1961 to 2018 in green, and the more recent period, 2010 to 2018 in blue. In the study, we have tables that show these balances for every decade. And in the appendix, I show the balances for every year. On a per capita basis, Alberta is by far the largest net contributor. That is, taking into account the total revenue sent to Ottawa versus what comes back. It works out to about $5,000 per person per year in recent decades. You can think of that as about $20,000 net outflow for a family of 4 each year. In the case of British Columbia, in most recent decade, it's about $1,000 per person per year, and Ontario about $580 some per person per year. Where are the negative balances, the net recipient regions? Well, the largest one is actually the territories. There's a net inflow of about $22,000 per person per year, but we've really not said much about that. It's really a very small population with the huge distances and other costs, very expensive to provide federal services in that area, and that explains a lot of that. In terms of the provinces, the net gain to Prince Edward Island is about $8,500 per year. In the case of the Maritimes generally, it's about $6,000 or $7,000 per year. I think for Prince Edward Island, sorry, for Quebec, it's about $2,000 per year. When you, next slide, please. When you look at totals as opposed to per capita, this shows the largest net contributor has been Ontario, over 760 billion, followed by Alberta at about 630 billion, and BC at about 130 billion. You can think of this as about 1.5 trillion in total transferred in terms of income, employment, and population from those three provinces to the rest of the country. And disproportionately, that is actually from Alberta. And you can see in the recent years, shown in the blue bars, that Alberta in total has been by far the largest net contributor. The other balances, that is for the net recipient provinces, range from Quebec at almost 500 billion over the total period, Nova Scotia at 320 billion, New Brunswick at 212 billion, Manitoba at 184 billion, Newfoundland and Labrador at 177, and Saskatchewan at 106. Next slide, please. To provide some perspective, we've related this to personal income. In other words, how large are these net transfers related to total personal income in the region? And you can see for the Maritimes, it accounts for about 20%. The negative indicates a net inflow. So about 20% for the Maritimes, about 9% for Manitoba, 6% for Saskatchewan. Now, in terms of the net contributors, it's about 10% of all the personal income in Alberta is transferred annually. In the case of Ontario, on average, about 4%, and in the case of BC, about 2%. Next slide, please. There are some indirect effects associated with these transfers. They're not all direct. So, for example, through trade patterns and through migration, we generally find that the impact of the amount of redistribution is greater. For example, in the case of Alberta, when we take into account these other adjustment mechanisms, they result in a reduction in Alberta's population of about 12%. And real incomes by about 8%. At the other extreme, it increases Prince Edward Island's income by about 30% and its population by 50%. When we look at the overall period and ask how much has this redistribution reduced market income differences, it's between 50 and 60%. So it's been a major leveler of income across the country. By market income, it's just really the personal income before taxes and before transfers, for example, CPP or EI, whatever. Next slide, please. So you might ask, what's behind these fiscal balances? As I mentioned, people often think really it's equalization. Well, that's not really correct. In this chart, or this table, we show for each province and each of 10 policies what the net transfer is. So for example, if I look at personal income taxes under Alberta, it's 8.3 billion or 8,279 million. Of the about 20 billion net outflow from Alberta each year, about 8.2 billion is related to the income tax system, the personal income tax system. About 2 billion is related to equalization, 3.8 billion related to corporate taxes, CPP net contributions about almost 3 billion, non-defense purchases 2.7 billion, old age security benefits 1.5 billion, employment insurance 564 million, GST 1.5 billion, defense purchases 485, and other factors total of 516. So you see in the case of Alberta, Virtually every one of these policies results in a net outflow from the province. In the case of British Columbia, 7 of those policy areas result in outflows. In the case of Saskatchewan, 9 of those areas result in outflows. In the case of Ontario, only 6 result in outflows. In the case of Quebec, only 3 for Manitoba and Newfoundland, 1 for Prince Edward Island, and in the case of New Brunswick, under all policies, it results in net inflows. And so you can see the nature of those flows and the explanation, and I'll just really focus on the first one, Alberta. Alberta has by far the highest per capita incomes. They have in recent decades been about 18% above the national average, by far the highest. And with progressive taxation, that means we pay a lot more to the federal government. We spend more, and as a result, we pay more GST. In the case of CPP, relatively young population. By the way, in terms of income, so much of this relates to not just average wages and so on, that's part of it. Traditionally, it's because Alberta has the highest labor force participation rate. People work the longest hours in Canada. They tend to be the most flexible, adjustable. They don't stay in regions or industries where there's high unemployment and so on. So the rest of the explanation has to do with the federal government spends very little in Alberta relative to other provinces, both in terms of defense and other expenditures. In fact, by far the lowest in Canada. So that provides an indication of the reasons for these, behind these fiscal balances. Next slide, please. I want to address the issue of whether this is equitable or not. And the standard definition in public finance literature focuses on horizontal equity. So regions or provinces with similar per capita incomes should have similar net federal fiscal balances. And then vertical equity, regions with high per capita incomes should make net fiscal contributions, and the regions with low per capita market incomes should have negative balances. So we use these 2 measures of equity to assess fairness or equity. Next slide, please. When we put this on a graph, and this is for the entire period, 1961 to 2018, we see in the bottom, we have relative per capita market income. So 100 means average for Canada. On the vertical axis, we have a measure of net federal fiscal contributions. So if it's above average, you're a net contributor. If you're below that 100 line, you're a net beneficiary. So that dotted line, the straight line, is really what we're calling the equity line. Any region above that line is facing a situation where its net contributions are above what one would expect based on horizontal and vertical equity. If it's below the line, one would say that they're getting net benefits in excess of what one expects based on market income. Historically, the outliers, Alberta, particularly in the 70s and 80s, its contribution was far, far higher than one would expect based on its net income. In more recent decades, Alberta pulled away from the national average. As I mentioned, per capita market incomes almost 20% above the national average, although in the most recent years, that's falling back very rapidly. There are some other minor inequities you can point out. Newfoundland hasn't gotten such a great deal. It tends to have paid less or received less than one would expect based on its market income. Nova Scotia and Manitoba, on the other hand, have consistently done better than one would expect based on market income. In the appendix for the study, you'll see that we've got a similar chart for every decade, and so you can see the changes over time in this measure of equity. Next slide, please. The 2 last items I want to deal with, and they're the most important from a Western point of view at this point, and that has to do with macro stabilization. As I mentioned, one of the objectives of the Federation is to provide stabilization or insurance to take into account the greater instability associated with regional specialization. So when a region's income or when a region falls on hard times, one would expect that the net outflows to the federal government would be reduced, combined with net inflows increase, so that would help offset it. At the same extreme, at the same time, I should say, when a region is booming, net outflows will increase, net inflows decrease. So we did test that, and it turns out that federal redistribution has significantly reduced the year-to-year variations in per capita market incomes in most regions. The exceptions are Alberta. It's an outlier. No real evidence of stabilization, and to a lesser extent, the same applies to Saskatchewan and British Columbia. The last element of stabilization has to do with stabilization of provincial government revenues. The provincial governments have a very important role in the Federation in terms of stabilization, but to do that, they must have relatively stable revenues. When a province's revenues drop substantially under the federal fiscal stabilization program, there should be a payment from the federal government. In 2014-15, Alberta's provincial revenues fell by almost $9 billion. Under this program, the federal government sent Alberta $248 million. So you can see it's not much of an insurance plan. In fact, we document the number of cases, the frequency with which you have fairly large revenue fluctuations in Alberta and to a lesser extent in Saskatchewan and Newfoundland. And clearly that's a program that's broken. I really would emphasize this is a real problem in addition related to the overall federal fiscal balance for the region. If you look at Alberta in recent years, the net outflow is about 20 billion. So if the province falls on hard times, you have to inject 20 billion before you get above water, so to speak. So that's a major, major problem in terms of stabilization. Last slide, please. So to summarize, federal fiscal policies since 1961 have generated a large amount of redistribution of incomes, employment, and population. Amounts to about 1.5 trillion in transfers, primarily from Alberta, and in earlier periods from Ontario and BC. I would mention that there's many, many years in the last 2 or 3 decades where Ontario received equalization payments that was no longer a net contributor. And so in general, well, overall, when you look at the equity lines, for example, and you look at all the provinces over a large number of years, and you think of the great diversity in terms of industry structure and population and geography, it's actually remarkable that the regions have been as close to that equity line as we observe. But there are some outliers. As I mentioned, Alberta is most often the outlier. And then the real big problem, as I see, is the stabilization issue. Thank you.
Sorry, I had myself muted. Let me do that again. A couple of options now for our media guests. You can either type in your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I can pose those to Robert. Otherwise, if you'd like a phone call or a Skype or a camera, simply give me a call following this. Following this webinar, and I'll set those up for you. So I'll count to 10. And see if any questions appear from our guests. Otherwise, we'll thank Robert and the staff for facilitating this, and then you can give me a call. So I'm quietly counting to 10 and watching the chat box. Okay, seeing nothing. Thanks very much, Robert. Thanks to the staff, to people who have attended. And there is a link here you can see in the chat box to the document itself, the paper itself, which is now available for download at policyschool.ca/publications or by clicking on that that link. Robert, just by way of a layperson summary, you've outlined the size of the overall fiscal transfer. The Fair Deal panel report has just come out. If you were providing advice on how to make that transfer less unbalanced, what would your advice be?
Good question. It's a big issue because it's not so easy. In fact, in most cases, almost impossible, other than exiting these programs or policies. It's very difficult to go back and rewrite the rules of the game. There are some issues. I noticed that the Fair Deal panel has taken up the fiscal equalization or stabilization program. Not so much on the equalization, although there's lots of issues associated with that program. But again, it's hard to, for example, in the case of Alberta, construct a case where we would ever qualify for equalization. I mean, we would have to fall on real hard times, have to be really no resource revenues. We'd probably have to have a sales tax, but I don't see any of that in the near future. A lot of the other things I think are worth examining, and we'll have to see where they go. I know that based on previous analysis, it's not a simple matter to try and change some of these programs, and I wouldn't want to give you any estimate of what the probability is that we could be successful. But I interpret it, it's a little more than just the fiscal balances issue. It has to do with, for example, in international negotiations, to make sure that we're at the table and our voice is heard. But a lot of it is in response to the extreme frustration, and as I mentioned, it's not just the related to just fiscal balances and the net transfers out of the province. It has to do with the politics in this country, the divisions. You've probably noticed that we have no MPs in Ottawa and very few in Western Canada. It tells you that there's some real unhappiness, and it's related to a lot of things. The continual attacks on resource industries, particularly oil and gas, but increasingly in the other resource industries, referring to our industries as big problems. As Donald Savoy points out in his book, Democracy in Canada, you know, any problem in Quebec or Ontario is seen, any regional problem is seen as a national problem, but the problems in the West are seen as regional problems. And so there's that backdrop, which is, well, I wish them good luck, and I look forward to seeing what they can come up with.
A couple of specific recommendations that are being discussed, of course, is an Alberta pension plan, as well as the possibility of emulating what Quebec does, which is collecting taxation in Alberta. Would either of those two go any way to alleviating the fiscal imbalance, Robert?
The taxation issue, I don't think is a starter. In fact, I think the Fair Deal panel suggested that it's not the way to go. It's a lot more administrative cost for Alberta. And the only gain is really to say that maybe we have a little more leverage because we control the collection, but we don't really set the rules for the federal taxes. We would just be collecting them. In the case of CPP, we had looked at that in the past. The devil is in the details. I mean, how you'd actually divide up the assets associated with the CPP, the mobility of, for example, people that are on the CPP and they convert to an Alberta pension plan, how that mobility is maintained. In the case of Quebec, it was much simpler because they opted out at the very beginning. So you started with a fresh page. We aren't. So I think it's one of those areas, one of those programs where you could look at and see if there are some adjustments that could reduce the amount of subsidy which Alberta provides to other parts of Canada through CPP, although that wasn't the intent of CPP, that is the outcome. And again, maybe there are some adjustments. Maybe there are some adjustments in terms of federal expenditures in Alberta, federal procurement, federal transfers, and so on. There's always room for some adjustments elsewhere to compensate for the fact that some of these programs are resulting in an extra large net transfer out of Alberta, particularly at a time when the province cannot afford it. In my reading of the polls and so on, when times are good in Alberta, I don't think Albertans begrudge the rest of Canada the fact that there are large transfers helping the other regions. But when things, when Alberta falls on hard times, people ask, where's the quid pro quo? We contribute a lot in good times. How come there's nothing coming back in bad times? And so there are other programs, defense purchases, other government expenditures, relocating some federal offices or programs in Alberta make a big difference. And so it may well be that those types of things will be brought to the table as well.
Last question for me, and then we'll wrap it. You and your colleague Bev Dalby have talked about the need to increase the amount of money coming to Alberta from the Fiscal Stabilisation Fund. Who's holding the purse string there? Who are the decision makers?
It's a federal program, so it's the federal government. Essentially, the government in power has the ability to make those changes. By the way, changes which are long overdue. I mean, it's really a program that provides no meaningful insurance, and the parties that are hurt the most are Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland. And fixing it would make a big difference. For example, it could mean up to $11 billion more for Alberta. And that's what I mean by looking at some of these other programs that where some adjustments would go a long way in offsetting issues with some of the uniform programs that result in such large net outflows.
Excellent. Robert, thanks very much for your time. Thanks to the media, and thanks for the staff who facilitated. Have a great day.
Thank you.